Sophie Hatter was the eldest of 3 sisters. When she was 2 and her sister Lettie was 1, their mother died, and their father, who kept a lady's hat shop in the prosperous town of Market Chipping, married his shop assistant, a pretty blonde girl called Fanny. Fanny shortly gave birth to a 3rd sister, Martha. This ought to have made Sophie and Lettie into ugly sisters, but in fact all 3 girls grew up very pretty indeed. Fanny treated them all the same and didn't favour Martha in the least. About this time, everyone began talking of the Witch of the Waste. It was said the witch had threatened the life of the king's daughter, and that the king had commanded his personal magician, Wizard Suleiman, to go into the waste and deal with her. But it seemed that Wizard Suleiman had not only failed to deal with the witch, he had got himself killed by her. So when a tall black castle suddenly appeared on the hills above Market Chipping, everybody was fairly sure that the witch had moved out of the waste again and was about to terrorise the country the way she used to 50 years ago. What made it all the scarier was that the castle didn't stay in the same place. Sometimes it was a tall black smudge on the moors. Sometimes it reared above the rocks. Sometimes it came right downhill to sit in the heather. You could see it actually moving sometimes, with smoke pouring out from the turrets in dirty grey gusts. After a while it was learned that the castle didn't belong to the witch, but to Wizard Howl. Wizard Howl was bad enough. He was known to amuse himself by collecting young girls and sucking the souls from them. He was an utterly cold-blooded and heartless wizard, and no young girl was safe from him. Now, just as Sophie was old enough to leave school for good, Mr. Hatter suddenly died. It then appeared that the school fees he'd been paying had left the shop with quite heavy debts. When the funeral was over, Fanny sat down in the parlour and explained the situation. "You'll all have to leave that school, I'm afraid. Lettie, I've arranged for you to be apprenticed to Terrorize, the pastry cook in Market Square. Martha, you know my old school friend Annabel Fairfax?" "The one who talks such a lot," said Martha. "Isn't she a witch?" "Yes, with a lovely house and clients all over the Folding Valley. She'll teach you all she knows. You'll be set up in life when she's done with you." Fanny turned to Sophie. "You, being the eldest, will inherit the hat shop when I retire, so I've decided to take you on as apprentice myself. How do you feel about that?" Sophie thanked Fanny gratefully. "So, that's settled then," said Fanny. Next day, Sophie's sisters packed their things and set off for their new lives. Sophie, of course, knew the hat trade quite well already. Since she was a tiny child, she'd run in and out of the big work shed across the yard. She knew the people who worked there, and she knew the customers. In fact, there wasn't really much that Fanny could teach her, but to start with, Sophie sat in a small alcove at the back of the shop, sewing roses onto bonnets. She quite liked doing it, but she felt isolated. The most interesting thing was the talk from the customers. Nobody can buy a hat without gossiping. Sophie sat in her alcove and stitched and heard all manner of things. By the end of the month, the gossip was suddenly all about Lettie. Terrorize, it seemed, was packed with gentlemen from morning to night, each demanding to be served by Lettie. She'd had 10 proposals of marriage and had refused them all. Then spring arrived, and suddenly everyone seemed to be buying hats and bonnets. There was so much custom as May Day approached that Sophie had to put on a demure grey dress and help in the shop too. When May Day came, merrymaking filled the streets from dawn. Sophie decided that she'd visit her sister Lettie. "I'll buy one of Terrorize's cream cakes," she decided. "I haven't had one for ages." She put a grey shawl over her grey dress and went out. She felt overwhelmed. There were too many people rushing past, laughing and shouting, far too much noise and jostling. Suddenly there was a volley of bangs from overhead somewhere. Sophie thought she was going to faint. She looked up and saw Wizard Howl's castle right down on the hillside above the town. Blue flames were shooting out of the castle's turrets. Wizard Howl seemed to be offended by May Day, or maybe he was trying to join in his own fashion. Sophie was too terrified to care. She ran. A young man in a fantastical blue and silver costume spotted Sophie and decided to accost her. Sophie tried to hide. "It's all right, you little grey mouse," he said. "I only wanted to buy you a drink. Don't look so scared." He meant it kindly, but Sophie gasped and fled away past him. Cesare's was packed. Sophie located Lettie among the line of assistants at the counter because of the group of farmers' sons leaning their elbows on it and shouting remarks to her. Lettie, prettier than ever, was putting cakes into bags as fast as she could go. Sophie had to fight her way through to the counter. Lettie saw her. Her eyes and her smile widened, and she shouted, "Sophie!" Lettie seized her wrist and dragged her into the back of the shop. She pulled forward 2 stools. "Sit down." Sophie sank onto the stool. "Oh, Lettie, I'm so glad to see you." "Yes," said Lettie, "and I'm glad you're sitting down. You see, I'm not Lettie. I'm Martha." Sophie stared. She looked just like Lettie. She was wearing Lettie's second-best blue dress. But now she looked hard. She could see that it was Martha. "But why? How?" "Lettie and I arranged it," said Martha. "Lettie wanted to learn witchcraft, and I didn't. It only took me 2 weeks with Mrs. Fairfax to find the spell we're using." "But what made you want to do this?" Martha grinned all over Lettie's face. "I want to get married and have 10 children." Most of the following week Sophie thought and thought. She was amazed at Lettie and Martha. There was a lot of time for thinking, because Sophie was mostly alone in the shop. Fanny seemed to be out a lot, and trade was slack after May Day. She was alone in the shop next morning when there was the sound of wheels and horse hooves, and a carriage darkened the window. The shop bell clanged, and the grandest customer she'd ever seen sailed in, accompanied by a pale young man with reddish hair. "Miss Hatter," said the lady. "Yes." "I hear you sell Miss Heavenly hats. Show me." Sophie brought out hat after hat, but none was to the lady's taste. In fact, she grew angrier and angrier. "You're wasting my time, Miss Hatter." "You came in and asked for hats," said Sophie. "This is only a small shop in a small town, madam. Why did you bother?" "I always bother when someone sets themselves up against the Witch of the Waste. Miss Hatter, I don't care for your competition or your attitude. I came to put a stop to you. There!" She spread out her hand in a flinging motion towards Sophie's face. The man stared at her in utter horror. "Come, Gaston," said the Witch of the Waste, and she turned and swept towards the door. While the man was opening it for her, she turned back. "By the way, you won't be able to tell anyone you're under a spell." Sophie put her hands to her face, wondering what the man had stared at. She felt soft, leathery wrinkles. She looked at her hands. They were wrinkled too, and skinny, with large veins in the back, and knuckles like knobs. Sophie got herself to the mirror, and found she had to hobble. The face in the mirror was the face of a gaunt old woman.